Darlene and I are like many of the households in this congregation this morning. We have had loved ones that have gone off to school. Our middle child, Luke, we moved him a couple of weeks ago out to the East Coast. He's living in a big city he's never lived in before. He's living in New York City. He's starting law school at a school he has no history with. And it's been really fun to connect with him. But one of the things that's been interesting to hear is he's trying to find his people. You know what I mean by that? He's trying to find those people that he can connect, that he connects with, that he has some affinity with, that he can build community with. And he's doing something that I think is a real normal human thing. You know, we are, as humans, we kind of like to operate almost in a shorthand or code where we like to label people and sort people as a way for us to kind of get a handle on how we fit in and how we belong and where's our place. So, for example, we label people men and women. We label people like urban or suburban or small town or rural, and we think that gives us a little bit of a handle, perhaps, on who they are. We label people as conservatives or libertarians or liberals. There's so many ways that we give people labels or we sort people as a way for us to kind of give meaning or to figure things out. Now, sometimes that can be pretty harmless. Occasionally, it can be kind of helpful. But sometimes it can be a real toxic behavior to engage in. And when I say toxic, when we start labeling people and sorting people in ways that marginalize them, that is incredibly unhelpful. And one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that this behavior is as old as time. As long as people have existed, we've engaged in this kind of labeling and sorting and giving folks identity and thinking that that gives us some kind of handle to make sense of who they are, who we are, and how we fit in. In fact, in the Bible, we read about this all the time. People do this sorting, this labeling, and they think it helps them better understand who they are and who others are. And the thing is often in Scripture, when it's religious people who are doing this labeling and sorting, they're doing it in ways that are toxic, that tend to marginalize people, that tend to put people in their place and elevate themselves. And so, we see things like, the righteous and the unrighteous, or the clean and the unclean, or tax collectors, sinners. You think of some of the Bible stories you've read. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? And so they put people in their place, often elevating themselves and demeaning someone else. So the passage that Pastor Kelly read for us this morning is a story that really has its origin in this sorting behavior, this labeling behavior. And the question the disciples ask is, who's the greatest? And Jesus, as he often does, he ends up telling a story, a parable. He teaches in a way that helps illustrate them. And he says, that the greatest are children. Now, the thing that's important for us is he wants us to understand this, that when we become like children, that is when we are at our best. Now, by that, he doesn't mean whiny or temperamental or, any of those things. But the thing is for us to understand this passage, we need to understand the culture that it took place in. Now, the thing about cultures is we almost always think our culture's the best. And we make a mistake when we venerate or when we lift up a culture as being something that's superior or that's better than. I was traveling many years ago. I took a trip to Haiti, and one of the members of our team, every single time we'd experienced something that made us a little bit uncomfortable or caught our attention or really opened our eyes, she would have a narrative, well, if they just did it the way we do in America, everything would be better. And On the one hand, I kind of understand it, right? We're used to what we're used to. We've got our own lens that we see the world through. That lens is how we interpret things. But part of what she was struggling with is understanding how vital context is the culture, right? And what she was doing is she was lifting up her own culture as being the best. And if everybody would just mimic our culture, sometimes that would make it better. Well, the thing we need to understand about the culture that Jesus is doing that teaching in is it's a patriarchal culture. And so it's oriented through men. Because of that, men were lifted up as being the highest. And then there was women, and then there was children. Not only was it patriarchal, it was patrilineal also. And so within the culture, and especially within the clans, it was that oldest male who was the one who was lifted up as being the greatest or the highest authority. And it just, the oldest son is lifted up over the younger son. I mean, that whole patrilineal culture was a part of what it was. Doesn't make it good, doesn't make it bad. It's the culture that this story takes place in. And so Jesus is telling this story about how we need to take on some of those qualities, those attributes of children, those who are most vulnerable in society. He was right away challenging the culture. He then goes on to tell this story about, what shepherd who has 99 sheep and loses one doesn't leave behind the other 99 sheep and go search until the shepherd finds that lost sheep. Now, once again, it's a really cultural illustration that in that culture, in that time, in that place, everybody would have nodding their heads in understanding. You know what? When I read that story, you know what I think? Who would ever leave behind the 99? I mean, is that a really smart strategy to leave behind the 99? Who knows what can happen while you're gone in the ravines and nooks and crannies looking for that other one? But you know what? What lens am I viewing this through? My own culture, right? And my culture at times does this kind of cost-benefit analysis that says sometimes, there are those that deserve or are worthy or are of more value, and there's others that are of less value, and you just cut your losses and you move this way. Sometimes in our culture, we can be somewhat of a throwaway culture, can't we? But you need to understand that in the culture and the context that Jesus was teaching, everybody was saying, absolutely right, no doubt about it, that if there is one loss, you go and you find it and you bring it back. And I think part of this story that we can all identify with is sometimes we take things for granted, right? And don't value them that much until something we've had, we've lost. Classic example. I never think about this. I take it for granted. It is in that back pocket. There's nothing special about it. It means very little to me until I can't find it. It's lost, right? Then all of a sudden, it becomes critically important to me. And when I find it, there is just relief and rejoicing. Let me tell you two more lost and found stories to kind of help you start wrapping your mind around this. Very first job out of college, I was the director of a place called Storm Mountain Center. It's in the Black Hills. Storm Mountain Center for Darlene and I is sacred ground. It's where we spent the first 4 years of our married life. And I keep looking at our South Dakota folks when I tell that story. But anyways, over in this section here. But anyways, we had a young pastor and his bride who were camp counselors like 7 days after they got married. Can you imagine such a thing? And we would go to a place called Sheridan Lake and in the afternoons, and we'd go swimming. Well, Colleen was swimming this week after she got married, and she climbed out of Sheridan Lake, and she realized her wedding ring was gone. It was lost. A year later, Scott and Colleen come back to camp, once again to be volunteers at camp. Once again, we go swimming at Sheridan Lake, and what do you think Scott brought with him? A metal detector. Guess what they went home with that day? Colleen's wedding ring. I mean, aren't there some things in our lives that are important enough and that are filled with meaning that you just do whatever you can to try to find it? Yeah. Last story. Darlene and I are camping outside of Boulder, Colorado. We have 3 young children. And you don't need to ask Darlene about this story, okay? So anyways, because I'm probably not going to get quite all the details right, but the key point is going to be really clear, okay? There is a stream that cuts through Boulder, Colorado, that is really shallow in this place we were. It's maybe up to about my knee, a couple feet deep, but it is really fast moving. I mean, that water is just screaming through. And Darlene wasn't there, and I was responsible for the 3 young kids. And we were having fun, and I don't know what happened, but my youngest ended up in the river being swept down this creek. So I race along, jump in, swoop him out. He's upset, I'm upset. I have no idea what's happening with my other 2 children at this point. But we are sopping wet, and we find the other 2 kids. We're kind of huddled together trying to settle down, and Darlene comes back. And you should have seen her eyes. And I said, "Don't worry. Paige and Luke are just fine, no problems." Do you think that brought her any comfort in that moment? It's not like baseball when you get 2 hits out of 3, you've had a successful evening. It's not like basketball when you've made 2 3-pointers out of 3, you celebrate. When you are responsible for 3 kids, 2 out of 3 is not good enough, right? So here's the thing. Jesus, He has come to show us a way where everyone is valued. Everyone matters. Everyone is included. And that was countercultural. Children were, if anything, seen as a hedge on the future. But right now they were a drag on the family. Doesn't mean that children weren't loved. It doesn't mean they weren't valued. But in that culture, in that hierarchy, Jesus wanted them to understand. And that's a little hard for us to wrap our minds around. I mean, the way we worship our children. But Jesus wanted to understand that even those who were most vulnerable, even those who were deemed to be the least valuable, the least worthy, had a central place in God's family. We are in a worship series in the next 6 weeks that's called All In. And we're going to be playing with that word in. Today we're talking about what does it mean when everyone is included. We're also going to talk about what does it mean when everyone is involved. What does it mean when everybody is invested? What does it mean when everybody is in sync? And we're going to be exploring about how important it is as a community for us to be all in. Now, I think this all-in theme works on a number of levels. Here's part of it. Part of what we need to understand is our involvement. When we are included and others are included, and when we are all in, part of what that does for us as individuals is it gives us a foundation that is strong and that is sure and that is firm for us to build our lives on. 2 really quick stories. There was a guy named Bob, and all of these stories are coming from previous churches. There was a guy named Bob who rarely did I see. We knew each other not particularly well, but he was in worship at a time I would never anticipate him. And sure enough, when he came out to shake hands afterwards, he said, Pastor Dan, can we meet? And right when I saw him in worship, before we'd ever even shook hands or he said he wanted to meet, I thought, I wonder what's going on in Bob's life. Well, when we sat down, one of the things, and it was just a heartbreaking conversation, is Bob had lost his job. And that was hard. But the thing is he said, you know what? Now that I'm employed, my wife has absolutely no reason to stick with me. And he was convinced that was the end of his marriage. And my heart broke for him. And it broke for me. It broke for me just because of the state of his soul in that moment, for the fact that he was now unemployed and he was in his early 50s, for that he was absolutely convinced that it was the end of his marriage. And guess what? He was right. That was the end of his marriage. But the other part I grieve for is he had little or no faith foundation in order to understand this experience. He didn't have a community. He couldn't put it at he didn't have any other lens to view what was happening in his life except the brokenness that he was experiencing at that moment. Second story, her name's Sally. Sally ended up losing her spouse to cancer. It was awful. Not anything we'd want for anyone. But Sally had this deep, powerful faith. It was the kind of faith that gave her a firm foundation to stand in. She was connected to a community that loved her and cared for her and was concerned for her and supported her every step of the way as she cared for her husband during his death and as they cared for her after that. And part of what her being all in allowed her to have was this firm foundation to deal with not only those joys and those blessings, but also those really hard things that happen in life. We also need to be all in, not only around individuals, but around community. Because community is one of those things that sustains people. My children were students at Pinewood Elementary School in Monticello. And one of the things that we would do is Darlene and I would take turns either being the person who would drop the kids off at school or pick them up at the end of the day. I usually was on that pickup route. And we'd all wait right inside the doors, and there's a line you're not supposed to go across until your students get to you and all that. But we were waiting for our children, and some of them are your friends, right? You know them, you connect with them. Some of them you know who they are, you recognize them, but you're not, it's not like you know them. Well, there was this one guy that I couldn't help but notice because he had the strawberry reddest hair and beard I have ever seen. And the other thing is he walked with a profound limp because he was missing from the knee down on one of his legs. And we saw each other, 2, 3, 4 times a week for like a year. And, we might nod a head at each other or something like that. But that was the extent of it. Well, one day he came up next to me and stood up and said hi, and I said hi back. And he said, "You're a pastor, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." I said, "I'm at United Methodist Church." And he said, "Well, I've found out that I have cancer, and they tell me it's probably only a few months." And he said, "I am worried sick." He said, "About myself, but mostly about my family." And he said, "Would it be okay if we met?" And so we set up a time to get together shortly after that. Dan and his family ended up connecting with the church. And he ended up living longer than they had thought he would. He ended up living about 1.5 years. But in that 1.5 years, we were able to meet regularly, talk about the Christian faith and life, talk about our hopes and our dreams and our disappointments and our fears. His family became well and connected within that faith community. And when Dan finally did die, we were able to celebrate his life. We were able to care for his family. And that family now had a community that was able to care for them and support them and encourage them, and where they were also able to make a difference. Part of what we are about here is investing ourselves in a way of life that builds people up, creates community and cares for one another, and equips one another in a way of life. The thing I think is really important, I want you to hear, is I think there are many good ways people can live their lives. You know what? Some of the nearest and dearest people in my life are people that have no faith at all. I mean, sometimes you hear that expression, spiritual but not religious. These people that I love are not spiritual and not religious, and I love them with all of my being. And they live good lives. Now, there's things I hope for them that they don't have, But I don't think there are necessarily things that they hope for themselves. There's other people that are spiritual, right? But not religious. For what, the church doesn't work for them. Or for whatever reason, they're not connected. But those of us who have committed ourselves to this way of life that we call discipleship, this way of growing in a way that is going to make us more caring and more loving and more generous, and is going to help us understand the truth that Christ shares with us in order that we might have the life that is available to us in this way of Jesus, is what we are about here. And because of that, we don't judge anybody else. We don't look down at them. We don't dismiss them or put some kind of label or category on them, except beloved children of God. But for those of us who have committed ourselves to this way of Jesus, part of what we need to be is we need to be all in. We can't just go through the motions. And part of what I want you to understand is you matter. Everyone needs to be included in this work. I am just so grateful. This is one of my favorite Sundays of the year because it's that season where we launch new ministries and we once again get to be blessed by the ministry of the choir. The thing about the choirs is everybody matters, right? You know what? The choir is diminished if all four parts aren't there. It doesn't mean they can't do great work, but we want sopranos and altos and tenors and bass. The orchestra. Did I get it right or not? Oh, I was feeling the pressure on that one, trust me. I'm also feeling the pressure on this next one, so you all help me out if I don't get it right. But how about the orchestra? We have what? We have the woodwinds, we have percussion, we have strings, we have brass. We need, ideally, everyone matters. Some of us are going to go watch the Vikings this afternoon. And everybody matters, right? Every role matters. Trust me, with the Vikings. You can have a good offense, a good defense, good reserves, but what about your kicker? Because if your kicker isn't good, right? It matters. It truly matters. And you know what? The same thing is involved with the church. Each and every one of us matters. When we are not present, when we are not invested, when we are not involved, when we are not in sync with this ministry, when we are not all in, there are consequences for our work. There are consequences for how our witness takes place. There's consequences for how we care for one another. Every time we join the church, we make a promise to the community and a promise to God that we will faithfully participate by our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness. It's a promise about being all in. It's this understanding that we are always stronger when we are in it together. My hope for us as a faith community, as we launch this new season of ministry, is that we are going to be all in. That we are going to invest ourselves, that we are going to be involved, that we are going to understand that we matter and that we need to be included for this to be what we are meant to be. And when we are in sync in those ways, we can have a powerful impact on our world. And we can make a difference in the lives of our neighbors and our members. And that is something that honors God and blesses God's people. Amen.